So we're going to do basically 3 40-minute blocks, which cover different sides of the shelter stuff. The first one, make sure all my gear works here. Aha. So the first one, understanding poverty and disasters, actually looking at what poverty is and how it interacts with this whole field that you call disaster relief. Because that interface is not commonly understood and it's not heavily talked about, but it's actually where all of the opportunities are to really solve these problems in a deep way rather than in a shallow way. And what I mean by a deep solution is a deep solution solves the problem and the problem doesn't come back. So you're not talking about a band-aid where you apply the solution once you have a problem. We're talking about deep structural changes in the way that societies which are vulnerable work, which leave them protected in the long run and in the future. So yeah, understanding poverty and disaster. The other thing I want to say is if you've got questions, interrupt me. Raise your hand, yell, throw things. But we're going to cover a lot of material, a lot of which is kind of controversial and a lot of which might not make sense immediately. So ask questions because each piece builds on the piece before it. And I don't want you to be in a position where you disagreed with a point and then none of the stuff that comes afterwards makes sense. So let's begin. So our current situation, right? This is the number of people in the world, 5 billion, 6 billion. This is their income. So this is $1 a day is about 1.2 billion, $10 a day is about 4.5, 5 billion, $100 a day, so that's $36,000 a year, which is about kind of truck driver salaries. When you get up to this $100 a day mark, there's really only about 1 billion people who earn more than $100 a day. It might be a little less than that. So at this kind of $10 a day level, your diet is primarily rice and beans. You've got basic medical care, you have a cell phone, your house probably has electricity, but it's probably not super reliable. In many cases, you'll own a TV set, occasionally you'll have a motorbike or a car. When you get down to $1 a day, you have just about enough calories to make it as long as nothing weird happens to your economy. And for example, remember there was this bubble of, there was an increase in food prices because of biofuels about 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago? So what you saw was this kind of area in here where people aren't quite starving, but they're kind of economically marginal. Food prices doubled, and suddenly a lot of those people who'd been fairly comfortable got pushed back into absolute poverty where they were really kind of short of calories. Something like 30 million people got pushed down that curve, and you saw civil unrest all over the world in response to that in urban areas. Because if you live in a slum, then you don't grow any of your own food, and you're economically dependent on market prices to eat. And you've only got just enough money for food, you're not really spending very much money on anything else. So if your food prices double, you go into absolute hunger. It's basically an economic famine. And this curve, this is the background of disaster relief. If you think of almost any natural disaster other than Hurricane Katrina that happened in a developed world area, by and large, developed world people are wealthy enough to rescue themselves. You can have some inconvenience, but at the end of the day, if you stand on a street corner with a handful of $20 bills in your pocket, it doesn't really matter what kind of problem you have, somebody will come and figure out how to help you. And this is really important to understand. Market pricing for emergency services is fairly cheap. If you had enormous flooding in Holland, most of the Dutch are not going to starve. Somebody's going to come and sell them rubber boats. People from neighbouring countries with pumping equipment will come to help. Their own government has a good deal of a reserve and is fairly flexible, and they'll basically just kind of take care of the problem. If that same thing happens in Bangladesh, the people don't have any food reserves, the government doesn't have any money, nobody around has pumping equipment. If they did, they're not going to bring it there because you're going to lose some of your equipment, there's no money to replace it. Same physical situation affects people completely differently depending on how much money they have and how much reserve they have, and their access to outside help is enormously affected by the amount of money that they have to spend. If you looked at any of the major disasters that we've seen recently, and you basically just walked up there with, 500 or 1,000 pounds, dollars in cash and handed it to each of the disaster victims, most of these situations would resolve themselves pretty quickly. Does this all kind of make sense? Yes?
You made an exception for Hurricane Katrina.
Yes. Well, in Hurricane Katrina, 2,000 Americans died because of government incompetence, right? I mean, they were already very poor, right? You've got some of what happened in New Orleans is poverty, but the real killer was this mix of poverty and bureaucracy. So you had lots of military resources, you had lots of civilian resources, you had lots of people attempting to self-rescue by getting the hell out of the city, being turned back by police from the bridges because they weren't going to have all these poor black people running into middle-class areas. And Hurricane Katrina was completely predictable. The disaster unfolded exactly as it did in federal disaster plans that went back 30 years. Why did 2,000 people die? Right? A disaster that had days of warning, that proceeded exactly as everybody expected it to from the government preparation, you still had 2,000 Americans die. That's 2/3 as many people died in 9/11. And our response to 9/11 was to invade two countries that had very little to do with it. And spend something like $3 trillion. You know, there's kind of a mismatch here in terms of risk analysis. So the reason that I took Katrina to one side is that in Katrina, what you have an example of is government bureaucracy, which is as bad as poverty. And this is something that you quite often see, where the government bureaucracy is so bad, they're unable to spend money on a solution. Look, we can buy this thing, it costs $500, it will solve the problem. Well, we've got to do 3 years of studies before we can invest in it. Okay, but in the meantime you have no money and you still have a problem. It's poverty caused by bureaucracy. It's the inability to spend on the solution. And Katrina had some elements of that, but mainly it was just an absolute disaster of bureaucracy. Does that answer your question? Okay, so, next. Boom. This is not an expected number, but every year 60 million people die of all causes. Old age, disease, hunger, accidents, the entire spectrum of stuff. 60 million people die. Of that number, about 30 million are dying because of poverty. Now, how big that number is depends who you ask. Food and Agriculture Organization says that 36 million people a year die of reasons which have some aspect of malnutrition. So what they're talking about is bits of vitamin deficiency, you know, a life without quite enough food security. You know, they're talking about all of these contributory causes. They're not talking about 36 million people starving. They're talking about small effects that add up. The number who actually just plain die of various causes: hunger, 3-ish million; waterborne disease, 2, 3, 4, 5 million, depends who you ask. Cooking fires turns out to be a huge issue. If you spend your entire life cooking over an open fire, it turns out to be the equivalent of, you know, smoking 2 or 3 packs of cigarettes a day. And people are starting to cook at the age of 5, 6, 7, 8. All of this stuff together forms this thing that I call the poverty cluster. And it's medical care, overwork, nutrition, vaccinations, stress. There's a whole list of things which generally lower your quality of life and lower your length of life. Yes?
Where do these statistics come from?
This is kind of a basket of stats. If I go back, I'll show you the slides later on, but at the bottom I've got the URLs of the actual studies, so I'll send you the PDFs. When you start looking, there's a longer talk that I did on this, which is on the internet, called Saving the World Through Open Source, that really digs into the statistics side of it. The basic case is that everybody double counts. So if you ask the water people how many people die of waterborne diseases, they'll give you a huge number. And they'll say water contributes to this many deaths. If you ask the cooking fire people how many people die of smoke inhalation, they'll give you a huge number and they'll say it contributes to this many deaths. Because what you see isn't that people die of one clearly identifiable cause. What you get is a general decline in health because of all of these interacting factors. So when you want to try and nail it down to a hard number of this many people die of this cause, what you actually get in the statistics is a lot of arm waving. So it makes more sense to go back and say, well, if you put all of these numbers together, you get this kind of bundle. And I think the actual death toll that's really just plain old poverty and infrastructure failure and all the rest of this stuff is about 10 million. But it really depends who you ask and how they want to count. It's a bunch of people and it's very hard to define in hard terms. But if you go through, you know, each one of these causes has a specific group at the UN or a specific charity associated with it who'll give you their ballpark estimates, and what they don't do is any real examination of the overlaps and the synergies. So I don't want to say I'm guessing, but it's looking at the statistics and making a best interpretation. Half is probably the influence, of which about 1/6 are hardcore, these people just died of being poor, period. Does that help?
Yeah.
So why doesn't this stuff affect us? This is a thing that we call 6 ways to die. And there are basically 6 ways that your body can stop working. You could be too hot, too cold, hungry, thirsty, you can have an illness, or you can have an injury. And these are the 6 fundamental causes of human mortality. Now, by and large, very, very, very few people in the developed world die of anything except illness. You get a handful of injuries, you get illnesses in old age. All the other causes stopped killing us in large numbers, usually hundreds of years ago. I'm trying to think, when was the last big famine in Sweden? Anybody know? 300, 400, 500 years, probably?
No, 1800s.
1800s?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, for it to be remembered 200 years later, you probably had significant mortality, right? Probably that's the last time that you had a significant number of people in Sweden starve. If you go to Iceland, they had some pretty serious trouble after one of the volcanic eruptions. Ireland had the potato famine. I mean, it's not a really, really long time ago that you had people starving to death in Europe, but it's been a good, half a dozen generations. So the reason this stuff doesn't happen anymore is that what we've built up is these very complex infrastructures that protect us from this stuff. So I'm just going to go out from the ring. Individual infrastructure is the stuff that you carry with you or you have in your pockets. Household is all the services in your house. Town is all the services that are provided at a municipal level. So, for example, your water supply is typically purified at a town level. In a lot of places, your power supply is done at a town level. Then you go out to the regional systems, and regional systems are things like transport infrastructure, major hospitals, fuel supply, fuel transport. All that stuff is kind of regional. And then you get out to the global level, which is primarily markets. Your fuel markets, your food markets, and all the rest of this stuff. So if we just take food as an example, so this is the transportation network that most of your food travels through. And on the international level, it's things like ports, and you get down to the local level, it's roads. And then food is warehoused at the town level in stores and in the warehouses of stores. Then when you want to cook it, you've got energy that comes from these international grids all the way around and is combined with your food in your kitchen, and it turns into something you can eat, and this is why we don't have hunger. Very little of the food is actually grown locally. The vast majority is taken internationally. And you've got this weird situation where all countries are exporting food and all countries are importing food. There's very little local self-sufficiency. Even if you're producing enough food to survive, typically you don't eat what you grow, you actually export it to make money to import it from somewhere else. Not a terribly efficient process, but that's how we do it. We come over here, the water grid, right? Again, very little action at the international level, lots of action at the regional level, where you get purification, transport, storage, comes around to the household level. Your sanitation, the reason we don't typically get sick is we have sewers, right? London, do you guys know about the ghost map, this guy called John Snow? So London had a cholera, which was a waterborne epidemic in 56. And people were dying of cholera, and nobody knew at that point what cholera was or where it came from. But a scientist drew a map showing all the people who died in London and saw that they were all clustered around a given well. So they investigated the few people who had died and who didn't live close to that well, and discovered that they drank water from that well because they happened to work in the area or somebody had taken the water from there or something along these lines. And once they'd ascertained the problem was the well, the guy went down to the town area and just took the handle off the well to stop people using it. And sure enough, when they investigated, they discovered that there was a sewage pipe that was very close to the well, and you'd got contaminated water. So that's 150 years ago in London, you had people dying of waterborne pandemic disease. And all of this stuff that was built as a result of those kind of situations is the water infrastructure. What the Victorian era is famous for is building sewers, gigantic brick pipes underneath everything. You go out, there's a whole pile of stuff there. You go out to injury, primarily what protects us is armies and police protect us from violence, and all of our safety regulations protect us from actually being injured. And hospitals will patch us up if we do get hurt. So this system is the Western infrastructure model, and it's fairly static. Industrial cities all over the world and the rest of society in the West and most of the middle class countries. Europe all pretty much looks like this. America all pretty much looks like this. All the urban areas look like this outside of the slums. Does all kind of make sense? Now, what happens if you lose a chunk of this infrastructure, right? I mean, if you take the electrical infrastructure, if you guys have an electrical infrastructure failure, your power grid goes down because there's some terrible winter conditions. Your houses are big, they're fairly warm, many of them have stoves, you've got access to fuel wood, you've got lots of clothing, you've got access to money to buy things like gas heaters if you need them in an emergency, right? If you go to some country like Afghanistan, where the Afghan power infrastructure is they get wood and they burn it, and they don't have tons of additional money and tons of additional clothing and tons of additional everything else, right? You got this Afghan earthquake that knocked over, 600,000 houses, something like this. Anybody remember the number? Might have been 300,000 houses. Anyway, it left about 3 million people without their conventional access to shelter or various other essential services. And you'd all these people freezing to death in these mountain valleys. And the equipment that the NGOs took out there had never been tested in heavy winter conditions and just didn't work. They had no effective rehousing solution for the Afghan refugees because that was the first time they'd had a cold weather disaster at altitude. And it was a real humanitarian crisis that the NGOs did not respond to in a particularly effective way. They didn't have a plan ready to go, and there was a lot of trial and error when they got out there trying to find some kind of tent system that would survive the weather conditions. So when you lack resilience, what happens is that when something goes wrong, you don't have any ability to get yourself out of trouble. Actually, I'm going to skip forward to here, right? Pre-existing poverty is what makes people fragile to disasters. You're already poor, you're already marginal economically. When something goes wrong, you've got no ability to dig yourself out of the hole. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. So I'm going to skip back here very briefly. So alternative models, right? If you want high standard of living and a long life, do you need to build all of this stuff? Do you need to modernize? Do you need to industrialize? Do you need to be somewhere way up on the income curve? The answer is no. Kerala, it's a state in India, 60 million people, 76-year life expectancy, dollar a day average income, 99.5% literacy, basically European birth rates. How did they manage it? Nobody really knows. They call it the Kerala model. It's also informally known as the Kerala miracle. How are they managing to make that work? There just isn't a really good, clean answer. Their government had a different set of investment priorities than most governments. They had a very different economic model. They had some natural advantages, like their population already had a long history of learning and education. But at the end of the day, it's an extremely remarkable situation that you can get Western life expectancy on $1 a day. That's not something that anybody expected, but the numbers are good, and it's just not really clear how they're achieving it. There are some real questions about, just how was that done? Yes?
Are there any studies?
In English, there are a couple books, neither of which I found terribly satisfactory, and there's a whole bunch of journalism, but given how remarkable it is, there's really a very, very deep absence of solid work on it. I don't know why every developing world country in the world doesn't have an embassy there trying to figure out what they're doing and copying it. Doesn't seem to be happening. Why is that? Well, the problem could be something to do with this, right? If it turns out that there's some form of communism that actually works, there are a lot of people who'd be very uncomfortable to discover that. And exactly what democratically elected market communism is as a political system, I'm not really sure anybody understands. It doesn't sound like it's actually communism because there's no sense of it being a command economy, and they're democratically elected. So is it some kind of European socialist model that's being implemented with the very poor? It's really hard to get hard information about it. I keep meaning to try and get some funding to go out there and spend a couple of years on the ground just mapping what they're doing, but so far no luck. Other stuff along these lines. Where to put my remote? So distributed infrastructure and sustainable development. So if we go forward, there are other ways of arranging your infrastructure which keep it more or less all at the household level. So if you need power, you've got little windmills, you've got little solar panels. You can do far more in terms of keeping your houses warm and cool if you work with particularly traditional housing models are often really good at this. Energy efficient wood stoves for cooking, solar cookers, local food storage and local food growing. There's a whole bunch of work on radically increasing the agricultural output in developing world areas based on organic agriculture techniques. There's a paper by a woman called Yvette Perfecto that says that rural farmers in the developing world could increase their food output by about 80% using organic farming techniques. And that's the end of world hunger, using no more ecological resources. I mean, that's kind of important. Again, how much funding do they have? Not a heck of a lot. Water, there's a whole bunch of household level water and sanitation technologies, Solab toilets, Potters for Peace water filters, solar water pasteurization, solar water disinfection. There's a whole suite of technologies that can handle sewage and drinking water issues on a house by house basis. And there's also a whole bunch of medical stuff along these lines as well. So you could talk about providing all of these essential services at the household or occasionally the village level, which provides you with the possibility of a very high standard of living without having to go all the way up this curve. And right now, one of the things that nobody knows is whether we have enough natural resources to have all that many more rich people. The current evidence is that we don't have enough natural resources to support the rich people we have, never mind 5 billion more of them. So there are potentially extremely hard natural resource limits that will prevent us increasing the size of the rich portion of society without completely destroying the world as we know it. And when people talk about ecological collapse, what they're talking about is the planet collapsing under the weight of the existing rich populations because the resource footprint is so enormous. And you know, if people are particularly interested in that, I can revisit it, but it's not particularly relevant to disaster relief, so we'll move on. So, bottom line, what is a disaster? Something bad happens, earthquake, right? Boom. Some people immediately die. They're killed in the collapse, their buildings fall on them, you know, they're gone. Infrastructure breaks down. So water and sanitation is probably the first thing to go because those systems are really fragile. Power grid goes down, you're left with the sort of chaos of a post-disaster setting. Something like 2/3 of all disasters are what they call wet disasters, which are floods, storms, tsunamis, and this kind of stuff. And those tend to be really, really hard to deal with because all of your water gets contaminated. And at that point you've got water everywhere, but none of it's safe to drink. So once that immediate crunch has happened, then you get this rebuilding phase. In developed world disasters, rich self-rescue. Remember these enormous fires that you saw around the San Diego area last year? Are these bushfires? About the same number of people were displaced as were displaced in Hurricane Katrina. An enormous number of people had to leave their houses. I think, I'm talking very loosely, don't hold me to these numbers, but an enormous number of people had to move. Does anybody hear about there being any significant problems as a result of that? No? Right. Most of them rented hotel rooms or went to stay with their sister up the coast. They were wealthy people, they could by and large transport themselves, they by and large had somewhere to go. If they didn't, they had access to credit. Just wasn't the problem. So the problem case is this. Poor people often die before the rebuilding occurs or before they rebuild. Because if you're making $1 a day and your house washes away and your farm washes away, you have no money to do anything with. So you're now basically living on a patch of ground with no food, waiting for the next harvest if it ever comes. And this is the fundamental mechanics of disaster. The real damage is when you take poverty and then you have a very sudden system perturbation. Right? You've got people who are economically marginal, they're hanging on by their fingernails, a disaster comes through and they go from just about making it to not making it at all. And that's where the dying happens. Does this kind of make sense? Now this is a very different model from the conventional models of disaster relief, partly because of the history of where disaster relief comes from. Most of the stuff that you think of as disaster relief is basically modeled on the UN model, the Red Cross model. And the Red Cross model is basically, they turned up on battlefields in Europe sometime around, 1870, 1890, handing out blankets and food to soldiers. So they had to be extremely politically neutral so that neither side would think the other side was getting unfair advantage. And they had a very fixed, very limited set of things that they were allowed to do on the battlefield without becoming combatants, without becoming, offending the armies on one side or another. So what happened is that other NGOs kind of copied this model, and you got this idea that we've got a fixed, limited set of things we're going to do, we're going to turn up, we're going to provide aid, we're going to leave. And that model got very deeply ground into the disaster relief world. Then you get World War II Europe, and you have millions and millions and millions of displaced people in Europe, and enormous warehouses full of army surplus from the various combatant nations. And you take the army surplus, you have volunteers who give it out, and you go and you rehouse these people in what are essentially military encampments, but without any military people in them. Demilitarized military encampments. And that's where you get your standard template refugee camp from. All these orderly rows of tents, one after another, all alike. X, Y grid, north-south aligned, central services for water and power and all the rest of that stuff. It's a military camp from World War II rebuilt by the NGOs in the present. These fundamental mental models have been carried forward through time. And it turns out that what worked in post-war Europe, where you had tons of army surplus and lots of trained soldiers, doesn't tend to work so well in the developing world, where you're dealing with people who are farmers, they lack education, they're already economically marginal, they have no real interest in living in a tent for 2 years, and you're not really giving them a choice about it. And there's all of these cultural issues around that. And then there's this simple fact that demilitarized military camps are not really how people would choose to live. And there are all kinds of problems that model doesn't address, because that model was for young men in huge numbers with massive supply chains bringing in food and ammunition every day. When you start looking at what families need and what you need to develop economic self-sufficiency, you wind up with a completely different set of problems. Do you see what I'm saying? Like this way of regimented tents, and every tent is the same, and you don't have any trade inside of the camp, and you don't have any provision for agriculture, you don't have any provision for education. It's what happens when you apply a conceptual model that was built for a military situation, and you just take the guns out and then apply it to a civilian population. Civilian populations have much more complex needs, because you've got old people, you've got young people, you've got sick people, you don't have these huge convoys bringing in food and gear. It's a completely different situation. But the NGO model has not really adapted past this kind of demilitarized post-World War II kind of setup. So, sorry, I'm going a little out of order. System interventions, right? How do you change this situation? First thing is, we've established poverty is why these populations are so vulnerable. Transitional solutions, right? Transitional housing basically takes this model, right? So you've got the military camp model. The tents last for a year because ultraviolet light eats plastic. Do you know this? Come across this? So any plastic object, thin plastic that's been outdoors for a long time, gets thin and it gets brittle and it gets stiff and then it tears and it falls to pieces. And it's very, very hard to stop that happening. Even if you use chemical treatments in the plastic, at the end of the day, ultraviolet light is really, really corrosive in the long run to plastic type things. And just about all tents are made of plastic or they're made of canvas. Sunlight rots everything. And as a result, the transitional model is, well, the tents have fallen to pieces and these people are still not in a position where they've rebuilt their houses. Now what do we do with them? And that's where the transitional model comes from. But transitional housing is not really enough, because if you just give these people houses, you haven't solved their problem. Well, now they have a house, but they still don't have any income, so they're now starving in the nice house you gave them. You see what I'm saying? You need to start thinking about what's the fundamental goal of disaster relief. And my contention is that it's to restore economic self-sufficiency, so that you put people back in a position where they can feed themselves, then you leave. And at that point, what we've got is a goal which is the same goal as development. There's no fundamental division between disaster relief and development. You go there, you take care of the immediate problem, they still have all the problems they had before, but their capital is gone. How are we doing for time? Give me
45 minutes until coffee break.
45 minutes until coffee break.
Yeah,
so I should wrap this section up, then we should take a little breather.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm very briefly going to talk about capital, and then we'll take a couple of questions and stop. So capital is the key, right? Does anybody want to give a definition of capital? Anybody kind of know what it is? Somebody take a shot. Somebody did economics. Yeah?
You can have an intellectual capital, or you can have a machine, or you can have like a piece of forest or something.
Mm-hmm. What do they all have in common?
It's power.
Power. Very good. Oh, I'll buy that. That's good. Any other definitions of capital? So, in general, whether it's an area of forest, whether it's training and education, whether it's a pile of money, capital produces something useful just by existing. Or you give it little energy and it returns you something really useful in return. So it's kind of like an amplifier, or it's like a well, but what comes out of it is something that you want. And the reason that the countries that we're in are so wealthy is they've got lots and lots and lots of streams of lots of reserves of capital in different forms that produce a stream of wealth that we all live on. Right? We each have a share in the cultures around us that supports us with this enormous jet of wealth that just sprays out of these cultures. They're like geysers of money. They really are, right? I mean, there's just, the West is a geyser of money. And that's a combination of hundreds of years of really serious cultural focus on education. It's relatively effective forms of government, although they have some problems now. It's all of these factors that come from stability and reinvestment over many, many, many centuries. And the result is that we are rich without really having to try very hard. In other parts of the world that didn't have these advantages, and sometimes these cultures had these advantages hundreds of years ago and it was destroyed by colonialism, sometimes they just never had those advantages, sometimes it's wiped out by disease. In any case, in places where you don't have these enormous reserves of capital, people are living hand to mouth. They have to scratch out a little money and then they eat it, and then they scratch out a little more money and then they eat it, and there's never this huge build-up of reserve that gives them resilience at a financial level. And without that, what happens is when something goes wrong in the system, they run into real problems. So the fundamental structure is that a disaster comes through and it destroys whatever capital they had, or at least destroys a part of it. And that can take the return on their investment from being enough to feed them to being not enough to feed them. And thinking about this in terms of restoring their access to capital gets into things like microcredit, it gets into things like land grants, it gets into improving their farming methodologies. All of this is about building up their capital reserves to the point where they can live effectively from their own resources. Does that kind of make sense? So this is sort of a loosely economic model of disaster, and what comes out of it is an emphasis on doing things differently from the way that they're normally done in a disaster setting. And that includes really questioning this connection between, really looking at this divide between emergency relief and transitional shelter, transitional housing, and saying actually we kind of have to think in a whole systems way. The objective is to get these people back down into a situation where their death rate is something that we find acceptable, and that includes thinking about their access to capital, one form or another, to support themselves. Reasonable? Okay, so done. That's the end of the first section. Any questions? None? Cool. Somebody. Example? Yes, good.
Okay, so isn't that an impossible task?
I don't know.
I mean, if you're saying that it's fundamentally the same as development work,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so you move into any area that has any kind of an emergency situation,
Mm-hmm.
and you apply development techniques.
Mm-hmm.
Development work takes a lot of time
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of resources.
Mm-hmm.
How do you do that? How do
Well,
you fund it? What's the structure?
I think that what we have to start doing is cheating.
Cheating.
Right? Because the current development models are very, very technology averse. They don't really believe in tech fixes, but all the evidence that I see is that the West got to be the West because of a series of tech fixes that we applied relentlessly. And I'll give you an example of this, which is malaria nets. The studies that I've seen suggest that the impact of malaria nets in malarial areas on farmers is it roughly doubles their farming productivity. Because they're not sick and their kids aren't sick, so they can actually spend more of their time farming. Well, that's not so difficult, is it? And if we wanted to really fix poverty in, sub-Saharan Africa, if we could go around to all the farmers and give them malaria nets and it would double their farm output, that sounds like a win, doesn't it? And that's what I mean by cheating. I mean, you can actually apply tech fixes, and if you pick the right tech, it can work. And I think that there are a lot of examples of things that I would call the right tech. Solar water disinfection, SODIS, really cheap, gets rid of practically all of your waterborne disease problems. It's less than $1 per head per year. And it's a technology that people can teach each other pretty easily. So I think there are a lot of examples of technologies which could be applied to development that also have applications in disaster relief, so that we could actually take the capital that we're investing in these areas to deal with disaster and actually think about it as a single step where you deal with the disaster and the development problem in one step. And I don't think that we know how to do that fully effectively yet, but I think that there are some really very promising starts that are really worthy of further study. Reasonable answer?
I just think it's not, I just think it's complicated, it's more complicated.
Well, I
You
mean,
have to convince everybody in sub-Saharan Africa that mosquito nets work.
well, I mean, I'm willing to try handing them out, and if people don't use them, that's not my problem. Now, I realize that sounds a little
That
hard.
doesn't solve your problem. It just, not to the argument.
No, please.
But that's development work. Development work is not handing out nets. Development work is convincing all of the villagers
Mm-hmm.
that their productivity rate would be doubled.
Mm-hmm.
If it were as easy, if development work were as easy as putting up houses, that would be one thing. But
Mhm.
there's years of education and PR work that go in
Yes.
behind the scenes, and it seems like a good point.
I think there are very deep questions about the development model at a fundamental level, very similar to the questions that I'm asking about disaster relief. But I definitely agree that it's not that simple, or we'd be doing it that way already. Right? I mean, there was a 70s generation where everybody thought appropriate technologies were going to solve the world's problems, and it just didn't. And it wasn't because the technologies didn't work in many cases. So, yes, I mean, there are definitely deep questions there, but at the same time, I think that we've got at least a few answers which are fairly plug and play. And we have seen that some technologies, like the cell phone, it just went. Television just went. The Land Rover just went. So if we can get something for water that just goes, and we can get something for cooking that just goes, then we've got really serious fixes for those kind of problems. And I think there is this need to say, well, in a lot of cases, the problems of getting technologies adopted are problems of the technologies, not problems with the transmission. You see what I'm saying? Like if we'd gone to Africa and tried to give them landline telephones, it would have been basically impossible because the technology just wasn't right. And I think there's a lot of room for looking at this stuff and saying, well, a lot of the approaches to development are basically trying to give people landline telephones. The technology isn't right, no amount of coaxing will make it work. But figuring out which technologies are like that and which technologies would work if we could just get people educated, it's a minefield. But I think there's room there for some new approaches, and I think that starting with the disaster relief stuff as a vector for getting that stuff done makes a lot of sense. And one specific technology is solar water disinfection, where you take a bottle, a clear plastic bottle, like a soda bottle, you fill it with river water, you screw the lid on, you leave it in the sun for a day, and when you come back the water is drinkable. It's been heated and treated with the ultraviolet light of the sun to the point where you can drink it safely. Well, that's a perfect technology for a lot of disaster areas. And it's also a perfect technology for when you leave. So that would be one candidate technology that I think could do this kind of combined dual function of disaster relief and development in a single step. Reasonable? I'm not expecting you to be convinced. I mean, there are real questions about this model, but at the same time, those questions are questions that are design questions. We can give this a try, maybe. Sorry, you had a question?
Well, sort of a comment to what you said. Of course, if you want to try to convince everybody before they start to use it, would be extremely difficult. But if you get one or two to start, they will be the good example, and the neighbors will see what happens in a little while, and then it's, so of course it will be slower in the beginning, but if you can start a process like that, it can eventually go a lot quicker. It's not a linear type of development necessarily. Plus, as you are indicating, many times the technology, whatever solution the Western world would think will work, is many times, well, they're not usable for that condition. No thought at all has given into the local situation many times. So I know you want to set up this UN tent, for instance, with interior lighting, so you can see right through it. You know.
Oh yeah.
And women will not use it, of course, because you know you can. There are plenty of examples like that.
Yes.
So,
And I mean, my answer.
I think one important here with this project is really to give a lot of thought and thinking into not so much the technology aspect of it, but more the cultural aspects and GNS aspect, all those issues.
One of the core things about this, and this again is part of my perspective, is that a lot of what we call cultural aspects are simple usability testing.
Yeah.
You know, at the end of the day, you know, the key to all of these technologies is you have to live in your own equipment.
Yeah.
You know, I've spent two and a half, 3 months in Hexahertz, and it's not nearly enough. I need to be living in one of these things for a couple of years before I'm really going to be able to say this works. And most of the people doing shelter design, most of the people doing infrastructure design are not using their own equipment every day for 6 months or a year. And one of the things that I'm trying to get funded is a village where everybody can bring their equipment, use it, and live in it for years at a time. And at that point, we'll be able to say with some authority, yeah, this stuff works. Good enough for me, good enough for you, come along. And I think at that point, a lot of the issues that we think of as being cultural will turn out to be technical, or they'll turn out to be, you know, manufacturing problems. And then there'll be some issues which are genuinely cultural. But I think that, you know, living in your own equipment gets rid of most of the things that we think of as cultural.
I also know that the manager for the Swedish Rescue Agency, the international department, who works basically every day with these problems, he said, when I presented this project idea to him, he said, this is the first time someone is approaching me with a project which is user-oriented and not, what do you say, production-oriented or resource-oriented. Most of the time he has companies coming to him, well, you know, we have this equipment so we can produce this and this. They're not thinking really what is the problem, what we're going to solve. And that's most of the case it's resource oriented, and so we get what we ask for, basically.
And I mean, really, if you guys can find some way of spending, say, you know, 6 weeks or a month living in the shelters you design at the end of the year, you'll learn a lot. What assets do we have to help with? So let's go back to think through this kind of disaster pathway. You know, people are injured, you get disease, you got damage to infrastructure, people are moved off their land, you know, that could be refugee situations. What people do for income is destroyed, you know, farmland is no longer accessible or it's flooded out. Infrastructure, if they had any, is gone. What can we actually do about this? And of course, you know, we've seen the standard approach, which is you turn up and you hand out tents, or you turn up and you hand out water, or you turn up and you know, deliver some other set of services. But, I mean, what I want to point out is that that's not the end of this situation, right? This model that we're using right now is basically something that was imprinted in World War II, or after World War II. It hasn't changed a great deal in 60 years. You know, the changes within, if you look at sports, right? If you look at something like, oh, let's pick something. Mountain climbing, right? In mountain climbing, between the end of the Second World War and today, you've seen something like 7 generations of equipment. You know, new kinds of ropes, new kinds of outdoor clothing, 2 or 3 generations of new kinds of outdoor clothing, new kinds of helmets, GPS, personal locator beacons. You know, I mean, do you know the kind of stuff I'm talking about? You've seen, you know, first generation Gore-Tex, second generation Gore-Tex. Radical transformation in the basic ways that we do things. If you look at motor vehicles, how many generations of design have there been in motor vehicles in the last 60 years? Anybody know about vehicle design? Yeah, vehicle design? No vehicle design. Okay. But you see what I'm talking about, right? Whatever field you're in, the gear that you use to do the thing that you do has changed radically in the past 60 years, probably multiple times, 4, 5, 6, 7 generations of equipment. Computers, just look at the transformations. So, in the aid world, the equipment that the Red Cross or the United Nations puts into the field now is substantially the same as the equipment they would have put into the field in at least World War II. It's big old pots to cook in, and it's tents that have a ridge line and wooden poles. It just hasn't changed all that much, and there are two reasons for this. The first is that there's no money for research. And what I mean by no money for research is no money for research. There's no allocation of budget in the humanitarian world to do R&D. So every dollar that comes in is allocated to help with this disaster or that disaster or the next disaster. And there's no sense in which this stuff is available for other purposes. Right? You can't take money out of the disaster fund and spend it on R&D because the money was never allocated for that. And the charities don't raise money specifically for research. So if you've got a field and nobody's investing in R&D, how are you going to get new equipment? How are you going to get new solutions? So that's the first problem. The second problem is even worse. Do you all know what a medical ethics board is? You come across this? Medical ethics board is the group of doctors and other people who decide whether or not it's ethical to perform an experiment. So you've got a new drug, you've got reasonable evidence it works, you want to perform a human trial, the medical ethics board says, okay, you can do that. It's a reasonable thing to do. So you do a double-blind trial, you figure out what works, you figure out what doesn't. This is how you make progress in science as it affects human beings. In the humanitarian world, there is no equivalent to a medical ethics board. So there's no R&D money, and there's no way to try new technologies in live situations. And when you put these two things together, it means that it's practically impossible to get new ideas into the field. It's really difficult. And you know, that's enough to slow up the pace of progress to the point where we're using substantially the same models and substantially the same equipment as was being deployed 60 years ago. So to move past this, right, there's a ton of really basic change going on in the game. You know, obvious technological changes in wider society, mobile phone networks, GPS, satellites, computers, biometrics, digital ID, all of that stuff has potential applications, right? You want to find out who people's kids are in disaster, you can just, you know, scan everybody as they go by and figure out who's who. You can really do that, so it's not all that difficult. Accountability in finance, once you've got computers in the loop, it's a lot easier to figure out where the money went. It's a lot easier to give people local authority to allocate money and to make decisions because you can get information about what they did in real time. So you can enable people to just go out there and fix things, and if something goes wrong, you can tell them, whoa, stop, because you get information about what's happening in real time. You don't have to have a plan that people agree to and then you send them off into the field to execute the plan. You can send them off into the field with a basic strategy, and then they can decide what to do based on local conditions, and if you don't like it, you can ask them to stop and say, whoa, we tried that before, it doesn't work, do this instead. It's a different management approach enabled by IT. Different kinds of infrastructure, we briefly talked about this. Solar panels, substitute for power. Solar water disinfection and solar water pasteurization. Both of those are new techniques that will allow you to purify water using only the sun. Toilets, you know, the Solab toilet, it's a brick pit, and it's a very effective toilet. It costs about $10 per house to build, sometimes less. There are composting toilets, there are all kinds of different technologies that can restore basic essential services very quickly after a disaster, but also would continue to function as development aid afterwards because you solved the problem that people have, and now it's solved, it wasn't solved before. Kind of make sense? Bureaucracy, right? The level of bureaucracy in this game is incredible because you've got governments and you've got NGOs The NGOs are handling public money, and their brand and their reputation is their ability to raise funds in future. The governments are developing world governments that are very sensitive about, the way that they're dealing with their populations and the way they're looking after their people. They're often a bit shy about asking for help. Then you put those two things together and you add some military as the only group that are actually capable of turning up and doing stuff on a huge scale. Very quickly you get horrific bureaucratic problems and lots of crosstalk and confusion and unwillingness to adapt and all the rest of this stuff. But there are new approaches, right? Once you start getting really fluid flow of information across organizations, once people really start talking to each other regularly, you could get these radical breakthroughs in the way that organizations work together that can be more effective in changing what happens in the field than any given technology. And I would think we're just at the beginning of a real kind of golden age of interagency cooperation. Maybe, that's what I like to believe. Okay, high-tech rich areas, that is to say us. It also applies to cities in the developing world. It applies to the more developed parts of even very poor countries. The big 6 assets that we have: money, right? Huge, just incredible amounts of wealth. Does anybody know roughly what the average Swedish taxpayer pays per year for tax? It's probably 10, 15, 20,000 euros, something like that? Something?
Well, it depends how you count it. If you also include sales tax and things like that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's just what people are paying in taxes is the total income of something like 50 people in a developing world country. That's just what people are paying in taxes. These are just enormous sums of money. So even if you only take a tiny part out of the taxable income of the entire Swedish nation, it's a ton of money to do research, it's a ton of money to find solutions. And if you take countries like America, oh my God, the Pentagon has a $500 billion budget. The cost of the Iraq War was $1,000 for every man, woman, and child who in the developing world. I mean, really seriously, right? We could have fixed global poverty for the price of the Iraq War, but that's nothing new. Okay, second thing, knowledge, right? Germ theory, understanding that diseases are caused by little animals that self-replicate and cause you all kinds of problems. Germ theory is not something that the average person in the developed world has access to. They genuinely don't understand why you get sick. And as a result, it's very hard for them to understand why things like sanitation are important. Now, in some areas that's true. In some areas they get excellent education. Sorry, did you have a question? But in general, germ theory is a really fundamental piece of intellectual equipment. And if you understand germ theory, you can make accurate decisions in all kinds of complicated areas about food, about water, about sanitation. You can understand something about how to manage an epidemic. And that's just with germ theory. We could be teaching 5-year-olds germ theory. It's just not that difficult. Right? So those knowledge resources that we have access to in the educated parts of the world are enormously important. It's materials science, it's engineering, it's medicine, it's the ability to build things like satellites, GPS systems. The knowledge assets of the high-tech areas are enormously valuable in terms of trying to figure out how to help people. Political and military power, basically stop that or we'll bomb you. One kind of power. Political power, will, we're going to be renegotiating these trade agreements in 2 years. If you guys are willing to compromise on this, we'll give you some of that in exchange. How would that be? Right? Political and military power particularly is very useful in cases where you're dealing with refugees and IDPs. So being able to say to a government, look, if you accept these refugees, we guarantee that we will not leave you in a position where you're unable to pay for them. We'll take care of that. That's partly money, but it's also political power. The military power side of it is things like UN peacekeepers. Like, whoa, big disaster, send the UN peacekeepers. Political and military power. Mobile expert teams, this is your typical disaster relief agencies, right? You turn up and a bunch of people jump out of a plane, run over there and do stuff. And often those people are incredibly highly trained and very capable. Many of them are NGO, many of them are military, there are a few other different kinds of expeditionary forces. But the ability to put people on the ground with serious medical skills and equipment anywhere in the world in 24 or 48 hours is incredibly valuable. and it's a capability that we can send in a very direct way. Advanced heavy logistics, this is your ability to get a 747 full of medical equipment or a 747 full of tents close to the disaster area in 36 hours. Whoa, something terrible happened, throw the gear on a plane, fly the plane, land the plane, deliver the goods. That capability is very dependent on computers, it's very dependent on trucking networks. There are a whole bunch of factors that combine to create that ability to just move gear quickly. And then finally, undamaged physical infrastructure. I mean, if the entire world had a systemic problem like pandemic flu, the developed areas would not be able to help the other areas. Because our infrastructure would be damaged, we'd have our own problems, we wouldn't have a secure base to reach out from. But for minor disasters, for disasters that are focused in one place, we can work from this undamaged industrial base and this undamaged platform, and we can reach out to put resources into the field somewhere else using the logistical backbone, or we still have a communication network that works basically perfectly, so we can shuffle information around the world from the secure base. Does that make sense? So these are this is my breakdown of the assets that the high-tech world has that it can use to respond to a disaster. Can anybody think of something that isn't on this list? Any ideas? I think it's a pretty comprehensive list, but I could be missing something. So, designers, right? Or at least we're functioning as designers. So we're part of the knowledge asset, and to me, this is really a core competency of designers in this field, right? There are things which really fundamentally have always been possible, but that nobody really discovered and turned into a technique. And a good example is solar water disinfection. Solar water disinfection is this technique where you take river water, put it in a bottle, leave it in the sun, the ultraviolet light and the heat kill almost all of the things that can make you sick in the water. And it could save 2, 3, 4, 5 million lives a year. It's a really big deal technology. Now, solar water disinfection was discovered less than 30 years ago. Solar water pasteurization, which is a neighbouring technique, was discovered by a graduate student in something like 1997. We've been pasteurizing milk for 100 years, something like that. And nobody, yeah, at least 100 years. Nobody had ever thought, wow, I wonder what happens if you pasteurize water. Well, we could pasteurize water, that would work. Could we pasteurize water with the sun? We could totally pasteurize water with the sun, that would work. And that discovery, it was latent in what was already happening, and somebody figured out that it was possible and that it was a good idea, and then they did it and they proved it to work. That solution had always been there in nature, but it took a designer or an engineer or a scientist to pull it out and turn it into part of, the human knowledge base, into part of human capability. And that's a huge breakthrough. Before they invented solar water disinfection and solar water pasteurization, we did not know how to provide safe drinking water to most people on the planet. Now we know how. All we have to do is do it. So it went from being an unsolvable problem to a solvable problem. Same thing with global food supply. In the past, we had no idea how to feed everybody, and then we got better agricultural science and we figured out that it was possible, and it went from being an unsolvable problem to being a solvable problem. Now, you still need to apply political power, and you still need to apply money to taking these solvable problems and turning them into solved problems. But we've done some pretty good stuff on that front. Anybody remember smallpox? Smallpox, right?
Yeah.
Smallpox killed 500 million people in the 20th century, by one estimate that I read. 500 million people. When it hit Iceland in something like 1750, it killed a third of the population in about a year and a half. Bam! Smallpox is gone. We killed smallpox. We found every single reserve of smallpox, and we exterminated it, and now there is no more smallpox. Fantastic, right? So it's not that we're not solving basic problems. Getting rid of smallpox was a huge win. It probably killed more people in the 20th century than anything else. All the wars and all the genocides and stuff killed maybe a quarter as many people or half as many people as smallpox did. So is it possible that we could take hunger and push it the same way that we pushed smallpox? Could we take waterborne disease and push it the same way that we pushed smallpox? We could just, push it over the cliff into history and it would never come back? I think we could do that. Because if every 5-year-old child in the developing world knew how to do solar water pasteurization and solar water disinfection, then you could easily wind up with that knowledge becoming part of human culture in the same way that many other fundamental skills are part of human culture. And once it's deeply embedded in human culture, it will never go away. It'll be there as long as language is. So I think that there's a lot of room here for really radical breakthroughs in long-term human problems. And there's some evidence that that's already happening. So, clean mental slate. You've really got to look at this stuff and say, look, in a lot of ways we might as well be the first generation to be looking at this stuff, because if anybody had solved this problem before, it would not still be a problem. Does that make sense? Right? Yeah, there's a ton of work, there are lots of things that you should read, there are lots of things that you should know, there are lots of things you should think about, but if anybody had gotten this right, there would not be a problem left for you to work on. Right? I came into this field in 2002 when I invented the hex year, that building you were all wandering around in. Previous to that, I'd been working on things like energy policy, and I'd done a ton of software work. So I invented the hex year, and suddenly I discovered that all these disaster relief people were like, ooh, shiny, we had no idea that was possible. I'm like, but this is really simple. But nobody had done it. Then I started looking around in the field, both at disaster relief and poverty alleviation, and there's a lot of work, but there's very little sign that they've found solutions that really, really, really scale, because the problems are still there. And then you look at the work in detail and you realize that a lot of it was just, it was done by people like us operating on tiny little budgets because there's very little real money in the field at this point. It's all really kind of string and duct tape and sealing wax and hacks and little corner ends budgets and stuff like this. It's not like you're operating inside of medical science where, there's been trillions of dollars spent to solve, these problems, and there are, hundreds of thousands of doctors working together on research. There are dozens of international cancer institutes. This stuff is not like that. Far more people are dying of all these, poverty-associated diseases than any of this other stuff. But because there's no real return on investment, the commercial sector isn't funding it. And because it doesn't immediately turn into foreign policy influence, governments aren't funding it. So it's this field which is filled with places where single individuals can make a pretty serious difference, because so little work has really been done. So it's not like you're coming into a field where everything's already been figured out. You're coming into a field where the big questions are still wide open, and the breakthrough could be, a graduate student invented solar water pasteurization. I was an amateur, I invented the hexier. Now, I don't know that the hexier is important to solar water pasteurization, but I'm saying it's perfectly possible for people to make contributions in this field that could turn some of these problems from unsolved to solved, or from solvable to actually the problem is gone. It's not something where you're operating in an environment where all the research has been done. We're just at the very beginning of this stuff. Does that make sense? I mean, can you kind of see that it's not closed field, it's a wide open field. So I want to talk a little about the hexier. Conventional approach, right? Tents are carried by plane into the disaster area. The hexier approach, instead you're going to use trucks to carry in plywood. Now that doesn't sound like a terribly radical difference, does it? I mean, it's not that big a shift. What goes along with that is, you wind up doing a whole bunch of construction in the field. You wind up relying on local skills and local knowledge and local materials. In later years, you could easily see a situation where people built the hexyarts using plywood without having to have an international agency come and help. So it's beginning to move towards a situation in which places like Bangladesh might become self-sufficient for emergency shelter, because they just buy the materials they need from India, or the international community gives them money and they buy the materials from India. So you get away from this kind of tent idea. And then, when you're done using the hexier as a hexier, you can just take out the screws and you can use it as plywood to build your house again. Or you can, use it as firewood, or you can take it to pieces and use it as spares for something else, or you can store it, or you can use it as an animal shed, you can live in it. It's a lot more multifunctional than a tent is, because a tent really only works as a tent. And it doesn't last all that long. One of the approaches that I've talked about is getting a whole bunch of people from, say, an Indian building company, the kind of guys who go out to build skyscrapers in Dubai, And you could train these guys to build hexayards pretty easily. It's probably a 2-day or 3-day training course, at the end of which, if you need to have 300 or 500 people turn up at a disaster site to lead the reconstruction process, you hire Indian building workers who are tough. They're used to living in these kind of terrible conditions, or at least bad conditions. They're very, very cheap, they're very hard working, and for the price of putting one Western disaster relief specialist into the field, you could probably hire 30 of these guys. And if what you need to do is you need to build housing really cheaply, maybe that makes a ton more sense than sending in foreign engineers. And again, this is this whole thing of building a South-South cooperation, where other countries could hire the same Indian building companies that had all of this experience building hexayards for their own disasters, and because the technology is so simple, the locals could come to learn and understand how it's done, and then the next time they don't even call the Indians. And this is an example of open source collaboration. It's passing along skills and knowledge to solve the problem. Now, is that a potential fix for all of the shelter problems? No. But it might work pretty well in areas where you've got industrial cities which are close to the areas with the problem, which have not themselves been damaged. And that's some percentage of cases. My guess is it's about 70%, might be 50%, kind of depends. So that's an example of a fresh perspective producing fresh possibilities that really isn't a very complicated situation. I mean, this is not seriously deep rocket science, right? It's a simple way of using pre-existing materials and an idea about, well, it's so simple anybody could do it, why don't we? The field is open to innovation, right? Any one of you could come up with something that is easily that useful and probably more. And you've got, kind of a research mandate where you can actually sit down and really think about these problems, and, it's perfectly possible you could come up with real solutions. This is not a field that's been mined out. This is a field that's wide open. And I just want to come back to this, right? In terms of the assets, right? These 6 assets, what does the hexayard use? Undamaged physical infrastructure, that's your plywood supply. Logistics, that's your trucking. Knowledge, that's the fact that it's possible. This is how you build a hexayard. So those are 3 of the 6 assets that have been combined to produce a solution. And if we go back to the assets, there we are, right? So it doesn't take very much money. If you did use money, you'd use it to buy the stuff. The knowledge is the simple design pattern for making it. Doesn't rely on political or military power. Might rely on mobile expert teams, but it probably wouldn't be the kind of people that we're used to sending. It would probably be developing world construction workers. Uses the logistics, but it's nothing more complicated than trucking. Physical infrastructure, that's the reserves of plywood and the ability to make more. So it's a different way of combining these assets to get change on the ground. Where are we? Okay, so this divide line between tents and transitional housing. Your average refugee is a refugee for something like 10 to 20 years. There are 30 to 60 million of them, depending on how you count. It's a big deal problem. This idea that you're going to put down tents on the ground and then when you go away, by the time the tent falls apart, these people will have built their houses again, it doesn't really happen like that in the real world. So dissolving that divide so that the shelter that you go out with on day 1 lasts for 5 to 10 years is a big step. Anything in that field will help a ton. Water, sanitation, cooking, power for telephones. There's a whole world of stuff there which has been developed in the appropriate technology world for development that could easily be repurposed for disaster relief. How do you make it lighter? How do you make it cheaper? How do you make it possible to pack 100 million of them into a plane? Lots of room there for innovation. Particularly because some of those techniques are completely new. Particularly in the water field, there's just a ton of new work there. ICT, huge area. All kinds of crazy stuff you can do with computers which might help for disaster relief. I mean, just point and stick at it. There's no end of solutions. I think there's a lot of room for using phones that can do mapping, which, probably half of the telephones sold in the developed world at this point are capable of doing maps. 5 or 10 years from now, that will be true in the developing world as well. You have a crisis, you've got mapping software that runs on a phone that tells you where the nearest food depot is. It tells you where the shelter resources are, it tells you where the medical resources are, it gives you medical advice. There's a ton that could be done there. Empowering people with resources and education. As governments run into more and more problems that they're having a hard time facing, they're getting more and more into this idea of individual empowerment, right? they're really not coping all that well with things like global warming, they're not coping all that well with things like HIV, they're not coping all that well with the economic problems of the world. There are lots of areas where governments are struggling as hard as they can to get a handle on situations and just not succeeding. And what's coming out of that is a new culture in government that says, hey, if the individual can solve this problem, you guys knock yourselves out. And there's a lot of room for that approach. The more of the load of responding to disasters that can be taken at an individual level, the more happy a lot of governments would be. Finally, this fundamental thing of restoring economic self-sufficiency, that's not been an explicit goal in disaster relief ever that I'm aware of. It's not been defined as, our goal is to put people back on their feet economically and then leave. So if you start out with that goal in mind, maybe you can find some clever shortcuts. One of the things that was discussed a long time ago was creating cardboard shelters like hexyards and building seeds into the cardboard. And the idea was that when you were done with the shelter, you could then put the shelter onto the ground and it would act as a mulch, and then you'd grow food crops. Now that's probably not a great way of doing it because you actually want the shelter to last for a few years, but thinking about restoring agriculture and thinking about sending tools rather than equipment or rather than solutions, there's lots of room for sort of ideas in that kind of area. I think you could get a lot away sending out bags of fertilizer at the same time as you send out your tents, pretty much. Try and get people started in agriculture as quickly as possible, figure out what crops are fast start crops, so that you can plant a crop immediately as the disaster begins to end, so that you've got at least some food coming out of the ground as people are beginning to recover. There's lots of room there for this kind of research. Very little work has been done on this. What are the constraints? Spending per disaster victim $20 to $100. There's just really not a ton of money flying around. Tents cost $100 to air freight, so if you're going to move anything heavy, it's going to be expensive, unless you're going to move it by truck, which means you've got to have it in the area already. NGOs are horrifically slow to adopt new ideas. I'm not going to say any more about that. How can people help themselves best? This is the key question. The more you can get local resilience, the more you can get people to clean up after the disaster themselves, the more that you can enable people to rebuild themselves, the happier everybody will be. Because we don't really get effective response to every global disaster. There are lots of global disasters that happen that never really catch the media's attention, so the NGOs never really succeed in raising a pile of money, so they don't mount a serious response. Even when they do mount a serious response, they don't get everywhere. In Afghanistan, there were lots of places the NGOs just couldn't get to because there was no way to get access. There are lots of situations where there just isn't enough money to meet the needs of the population. And the NGOs turn up and they do what they can, but if they don't have enough money to provide, they don't have enough money. So the more you can think about things that will help people to help themselves and that can be taken over by indigenous populations, so the people of Bangladesh learn some new technique and that becomes how they solve the problem in future, the more of that you can do, the better. Working on poverty, not just disaster. Again, fundamentally poverty is why people are so vulnerable to disaster. The more you can do about the underlying poverty before, during and after a disaster, the better. And I think there really is a ton of room for having systems that go out there in a disaster that remain as development aid. And I think water and sanitation are really key areas for that. Finally, really a lot of new stuff is happening in the world. If you go back 5-10 years, internet, GPS, a whole bunch of new science about disease, better access to advanced medical testing through biotechnology. There's really a lot of new stuff happening. At foreign policy level, you can see the decline of US power is a big part of what's happening globally. The UN is beginning to get a lot more ambitious. European Union has much tighter integration. The world is really changing in some very interesting ways. So there's lots of room there to update existing models of how various kinds of business processes are done, how various kinds of technologies are used in ways that will open up new possibilities. Does that make sense? I mean, do you sort of see the scope there? Right? As the technological base shifts and as the scientific base shifts, you can look at old problems, you apply the new ideas, and you can get real progress. Are we there already? Good work. What time is it?
10 past.
10 past.
So it's
Is that when we were supposed to finish?
It's
Look at that, cool, okay. So the final section that we'll do after the break, design for scalability. How do you get a solution that will work on the scale of the problem rather than just live inside a laboratory? So design for scalability. What I mean by this is these are really, really kind of large problems, and what you want is solutions which are realistically applicable to the problem as a whole. You don't want to solve it for just one little corner or one specific sub-problem. You want to produce something which is credibly a solution for the entire mess, right? Could you just check, is that camera actually catching the whole screen?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I'll give you an example of this, which is the tent, right? The tent is not a great solution in some ways. It doesn't last very long in the sun. That's its main problem. But at the end of the day, tents are workable in almost every situation. And we use an enormous number of them for all kinds of situations. And a tent is a scalable solution. It kind of works. A solution that turned out not to be scalable is the geodesic dome.
What?
Geodesic domes, you know, Buckminster Fuller,
Yeah, okay.
right? It looks fine on paper. In practice, it turns out not to be scalable because they're just too freaking difficult to produce. Right? And they're really, really, it's a bunch of math, and if you get your pieces slightly wrong, they don't fit, and if they don't fit, there's really no way of understanding why. They're very difficult to waterproof. I mean, there's a bunch of practical problems with domes. Tents are scalable. Domes turn out not to be yet. Maybe you need CAD/CAM manufacturing, maybe you need new materials technology, maybe there's some fit trick that we missed, but the dome is not scalable in the same way. Other examples of things which are genuinely scalable: Coca-Cola, cell phones, Land Rovers, television, radio. Refined sugar, caffeine. Right? These are things that were not globally available, but it turns out that people like them so much they will pay to have them available almost anywhere in the world. Right? And you can get a carburetor for a Land Rover within 100 miles of just about anywhere on the planet. And there's a reason for that. The Land Rover really, really, really works. So scalability is about producing things that can be used on a very broad scale that solve fundamental problems, and ideally that people are willing to pay for, at least to the point where their willingness to pay matches the cost of providing the product or service. Does all kind of make sense? Now, to get to that point, it's a combination of skill and luck, and frankly most of it is luck. You know, if you looked at 100 products, it would have been very hard to predict that the cell phone would go everywhere, but say the transistor radio would, because there are now far more cell phones than transistor radios, but it's way more expensive, and you need this grid, and it costs money, and you know, it's hard to predict what will and won't work. That doesn't mean we don't try, it just means you try a bunch of stuff and you see what succeeds in the marketplace. And I don't necessarily mean the commercial marketplace. There are lots of definitions of the marketplace. It comes down to you see what people like. But as always, there are some actual, you know, scalability metrics, right? So if we run over this list, strictest definition for refugees, 9 million people. 9 million people is about the size of Sweden, yeah? A little more? That's about the strictest definition. If you expand that to other definitions, there are other parts of the UN that would say it's closer to 30 to 60 million. And by the time you include internally displaced people, questionable situations like Gaza, by the time you stack all of these people up and you add the Iraq War numbers and all the rest of it, you get much, much larger numbers. This is beginning to be, you know, a pretty sizable percentage of the population of Europe. It's about the size of Britain. Typical stay is decades in camps. So wherever you're going to produce, we probably don't need a replacement for the tent because the tent lasts fairly well for a year and kind of sort of works. Improved tents, maybe, there might be some room for an improved tent, but kind of the tent thing is done. But long stay stuff, very important. Consumption of disaster relief tents, according to the NRC, 6 to 40 million tents a year. So $100, a typical tent is about $300 to $350. We'll call it 300. So 6 by 300, $180 million of tents in a slow year, something like $1 billion of tents in a big year. So there's really a ton of money going through this disaster relief tent industry, all of which is potentially money that could be funding new solutions. And if you came up with a solution that was significantly cheaper to implement, there's a pile of money to be made there, which pays for scaling the solution globally. It's not that there isn't enough money to actually approach this. Somebody's spending a ton of money on tents. 100 million homeless globally, I think that's actually kind of an underestimate. I have no idea how that number was prepared. It looks low to me. Billion, but it is an official number from, I can't remember which UN body, one of them. I have references, I can't dig them out if anybody wants to know. Billion plus very poor people, that's the dollar a day and less community. You know, when you really begin to look at what it takes to rebuild after disasters, these folks are living in essentially a permanent state of disaster. It's not that everything they own was destroyed by a tsunami, it's that everything that they owned never existed because it was destroyed by the way their economy functions. They never had anything, they never had. And this last thing, continuum of shelter solutions. You know, from mild climates where people are only going to be outdoor for a few weeks, all the way through to awful mountain conditions with tons of snow where people are going to be for, 20 years. There's a huge range of solutions there. It'd be very nice if we could find something that worked in the worst cases, but even if we get a real breakthrough in the easy cases, that's still real progress. Let's see if we're okay. Does this kind of make sense? Right, it's a continuum of problems, and you can get some of the easier cases and then work out from there, and that's a process. Okay, scalability factors. If it costs an additional £1 per shelter, an additional $1 per shelter, an additional €1 per shelter, by the time you look at 6 to 40 million shelters a year, that turns into a lot of money. So every dollar that you can save on the shelter design is useful. Logistics, NGOs want it small and light. NGOs are very, very attached to this idea of you load your stuff into a plane and you fly it there. Practically speaking, I think that's one of the biggest areas for innovation, because in a lot of the world, if you can manufacture it locally in a big industrial city, you can drive it by truck rather than fly. And once you talk about driving things in a truck, it's a whole different ballgame. Yes, sir?
Yeah, just sort of related to what you're saying, when we had the Swedish rescue agency here a little more than a year ago. They said that it would be preferable that these solutions could be produced locally. As much as possible, it can be produced locally, the better it is, or near as close as possible. So
good. Because I do feel that there's enough industrial capacity in India, in Africa, in South America to do a lot of this stuff, and that doesn't mean you can get to everywhere. There are certainly some situations where you're going to wind up flying in shelters regardless of what you do, because the area is pretty much inaccessible, or it's 500 miles from the nearest thing that looks like an industrial centre, 1,000 miles. But in a lot of cases, South Africa's got heavy industrial production capability, and there's reasonable road access to a pretty good chunk of Africa. If you could manufacture what you need for disasters in South Africa rather than making it in Pakistan and flying it, that's clearly a win. So material supply chain. Graham Saunders, who's one of the IFRC guys, International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent guys, talking about shelter, says that for real production use, for actual technologies that they're going to standardize on using, about their minimum buy is 100,000 units. And it turns out that getting 100,000 units of pretty much anything produced is a big problem. Because if you work with some kind of exotic material, when you go back to them and say, look, what we'd like to buy is 100,000 units, they're going to come back and say that's 5 years of our global production. And then you say, and worse, it's spike production. So we don't need 100,000 units every year. What we need is 100,000 units, and then they're going to go and field test those. And then they're going to come back in 2 more years, and then they might want 500,000, or they might not want any more. So it's extremely uneven production. What that means is that when you consider the materials that you want to use, you want to look for materials that are already in colossal global production. You want to pick stuff which is really, really common and produced in vast quantities, so that you're pulling off an existing material supply chain. You don't want to have to finance the capital investment for new factories to produce complicated new materials. You don't want to take a material that exists that isn't used very widely and then say, well, here's our shelter using it, because the odds are that financing the scale up of those factories is going to be extremely difficult inside of this model, because the production is just, it's really, really, really unpredictable. Sometimes they want lots, sometimes they don't want any, sometimes there are lots of disasters, sometimes there are none. So as far as possible, think about light things that require very little capital to mass produce, because most of the stuff that's in that system is already being used a lot. Does that kind of make sense? And this is fairly sort of technical stuff, but as designers, it's worth understanding. Yes.
Yeah, I was thinking, when you're talking about local products and manufacturing locally, I suppose you're talking about when the shelters are upgraded and not the first send out, because you don't know perhaps what can be reached for in 1 week, or so it takes a little time to figure out what you can get from that country or to get from places that are pretty close. And so this is more, what you're talking about isn't the first delivery, it's deliveries that's
No, I'm
come
talking
later
about
on.
first delivery.
But how can you know what you can find in 2 days in that particular country
Well,
and make something out of it?
there just aren't that many countries. What we need is a global map. We need somebody to get, you know, years worth of funding to basically work their way around the embassies of damn near every country on earth and say, what do your industrial centres produce in terms of materials? What
But
do
then
have
you are
available?
to manufacture it when you need it and not have it stored.
Mhm.
So how can you manufacture a lot of things like in such short a time?
Well,
in 2 days.
here's the production process for a hexagon. You take a plywood sheet, 4 feet by 8 feet, which is the standard size. You use whole sheets for the walls, and for the roof, you cut the sheet in half from one corner to the other corner, either using a manual saw or using a power saw. Then you put it together with a screw gun.
Okay, so because that leads me
Right.
to another question I was thinking about. The thing about the hexagon, because I haven't really understood what is the benefits of that particular design. Why is it a hexagon or is it a square or anything
yes.
else, and what it's made of, and how do you build it
Yep.
to make it as sufficient as you described it? Could you perhaps?
Oh, sure. Well, I'll give you
explain
the
that?
nutshell answer, right? And I don't want you guys to walk onto this as the perfect shelter, right? What I want to explain is the process by which it came into existence. So the question was, how do you make an extremely manufacturable geodesic dome? You know, I was working on geodesic domes off and on since the mid-1990s. I did a whole bunch of math that turned out to be very useful to a lot of people. You know, corrected printing errors in Buckminster Fuller's patents. You know, I mean, I was a dome guy. But at the end of the day, it turns out that geodesic domes they suck to manufacture. You can't get below about 25% wastage from standard material sizes. So, in the process of simplifying the geodesic dome, I came up with this shape, the hexagon. And I said, oh, that's kind of interesting. Maybe somebody would have a use for that. But I didn't really have an application in mind until there was a design competition, design meeting at the Rocky Mountain Institute that specifically talked about a new generation of disaster response. And one of the things they said was, it'd be really great if we had a shelter that you could put up in the field, and when you were done, you could fold it up again, move it on a truck and unfold it. Because then you could take refugee camps, and you could have all of the people in the refugee camp, and when the time came to resettle them, you could put their shelters on a truck, village by village, drive the truck to the village, unload the tent, unload the shelters, and then the villagers could walk, and it would take them 5 or 6 days to get home, but then they could put their shelters back up again. And I said, well, that's really interesting. I happen to know that this thing will fold. Here's the folding hexagon design. How does that solve the problem? And everybody went, ooh, this is very clever. So that was the design specification. It was designed as a shelter that would be mobile.
What do you mean by foldable? Because if it's made of plywood, I don't
okay.
really see the foldability.
That's absolutely correct. I'll show you what I mean by foldable. Give me just 1 second here. Sorry. Sorry. Here we go. So this is one kind of folding hexagon, and this is the very small size. You see, it just pops out.
But what is it that's made out of paper cardboard?
Well, this one is definitely not plywood, right?
No.
But you
So
can
is that usable in a real environment, or that's just
Well,
for showing
that's an
the idea?
That's an excellent question. When we first developed that model, the understanding was that we were operating off was this idea that we were going to mass manufacture these things and then stockpile them.
Mm.
And that was a very, that seemed like a reasonable idea. But then we actually looked at the situation in more detail, and it began to be apparent that we needed a different approach. And I'm trying to find. So there's this question about whether you stockpile or whether you manufacture locally. And this is a demonstration I did for the Netherlands Red Cross in Eindhoven. So whether you stockpile or whether you manufacture locally comes down to economics. So in an African setting where you're dealing with refugee camps, it might make sense to manufacture these things ahead of time, and then the next year when you're going to go take out the next round of tents for the refugees, you take out these instead of another round of tents. Because you've got a year's lead time. You know that you're going to be replacing the shelters for that population, so you take them out a different shelter, then the next year you don't take them out a new shelter. On the other hand, if you're dealing with something like flooding in Bangladesh, every 3 or 4 years suddenly you've got 3 million people homeless. And in that situation, you're not going to mess around with all this folding stuff. You're going to make something that's quick and efficient and dirty and cheap and just works. And it just so happens that you've got the same basic geometry that can be made as an expensive folding unit that you stockpile or a cheap unit that you put together with screw guns. The fact is that the Hexiart is only a shape. There are radically different manufacturing technologies that come off that.
That was kind of what I was
Yeah.
fishing for here.
Exactly,
What
right.
what's the thing about it?
It's an observation, right? I mean, the simple truth of it, right, is the Hexiart is defined by the fact that that's half of a standard industrial panel. That's all a Hexiart is. It's a building you make with standard size industrial panel materials. And you can adjust it a little if you've got non-standard material sizes like we have here. There's really nothing clever about it, right? It's not, why it wasn't invented 50 years ago, I have no idea. But because it works with standard industrial sized pieces, it makes it very, very easy for you to go out there and produce enormous scale without having to have heavy investment in infrastructure. So it's kind of a sweet spot. You can make it with a whole bunch of different materials, you can make it with a whole bunch of different properties, you can make it in enormous volumes from existing stuff, and it's not so difficult to make that you can't train builders to make it. Right? Even very, very simple. The basic recipe of cut 6 of the boards in half and screw them together, Bob, is something that you can easily imagine becoming an indigenous capability. Sorry, what were you going to say?
No, it was just that I can understand the benefits when it's foldable, that you have some kind of system so you can just fold it out. But if you are making it out of other materials and they are producing it locally, then I don't understand the benefits of the shape of it. Then it could be whatever shape. Or why is it a hexagon? And
Okay. So it's 6 sides, because if it's 7 sides, the roof doesn't have any point.
Okay.
Right?
But whereas in square, for example, normal houses are usually square.
If it's square, it uses almost twice as much material for every square foot of area inside of it.
Okay.
The closer you get to a hemisphere, the more efficient your use of surface is. So 6 sides gives you a pretty good compromise, right, between material use and roof slope. If you're building it in a snow area, you might do 5 sides or even 4 sides to give you a roof that had enough point that snow would come off of it. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's a guess, right? We've prototyped these things, we've tested them extensively in America, they seem to work great. We've got a whole bunch of folks who are very interested in the idea, but there's no commercial production version and there's no official field test. And a lot of the things that I've described about lack of money to do innovation in the NGO world comes from years of saying, look, we have this technology, it's free, anybody can use it, anybody can manufacture, anybody can test. Are you guys interested in doing that? And having NGOs say, oh, this is really, really interesting, when you have some test data, let us know. Oh, well, do you want to help us get some test data? No, we have no funds to do that. Well, how did you think this was going to happen? There's no model of partnership between the NGOs and the individual to try and develop new technologies. And this is part of what's so exciting about the involvement of the Swedish Rescue Agency. that you've actually got a situation where an NGO is coming and saying, we're open to new ideas, what do you have? And that happens very rarely, and it's very important to work with them closely when the opportunity exists. So yeah, you can see, but I actually made that building, I cut the panels and put them together in the way that the fold does on my own earlier that day. So it took me about 4 or 5 hours of hard work, which is difficult because the panels are quite large for one person to move around and hold in position to tape. So it took me about 4 or 5 hours on my own to assemble the building, and then we could put it up in about 15 minutes.
But you did it here today, this morning, 3 people took you up.
Oh,
Was it
just
1
over an
hour?
hour?
Yeah.
And we weren't even working particularly
No,
hard.
no.
You know, it's not a difficult thing. And if I had 3 people, it would have taken me an hour or an hour and a half to tape it together.
Yeah.
If you imagine mass manufacture, it would be pretty easy. So the point that I'm making is that the reason it's worth looking at this as a starting point is it works from existing material supply chains. It's pretty simple, and it's not finished. It's not all the way to a commercial product. We haven't researched what materials are available in different parts of the world. We haven't gotten an NGO to pitch in and buy it, and we haven't gotten a company that's actually going to do commercial production. I got funding in 2007 from a company that came pretty close, and then there was the actually 2008, and then there was the economic downturn, and they were like, we can't do this. We don't think it's going to work. So there's lots of room here, because it's an open design. Anybody could start a company to manufacture these things. Anybody could refine the design into something that was a product. Anybody could build off this to do something new. But it's a worked example of what happens if you say, well, what can we do with local materials? What can we do with stuff that's already in the supply chain? How do we work with the industrial base? What happens if we assume trucks rather than planes? And there are lots of ways of questioning these basic assumptions about the disaster relief tent to come up with new answers. The other thing, which is not apparent from this one, is the number one reason for using a hard panel rather than using a fabric skin is that you can put aluminum on the outside of the hard panel. You can take wallpaper paste and tin foil, or you can have it manufactured with an aluminum skin. What aluminum gets you is ultraviolet light resistance. If you put 100 microns of aluminum on the outside of this, the aluminum will not degrade in the sun, so you can make the shelter last essentially forever. And that was the real breakthrough. The reason we want to use hard-sided materials isn't just because it's better quality shelter, it's because you can make the outside reflective, which makes the building interior cooler, and it allows the building to last a long time exposed to the sun. And that was really kind of the big breakthrough. So it is just this thing of, it's one approach to all these fundamental questions. It's one approach to a different solution.
May I ask just?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, please.
I suppose you have heard or have something to do with shelter center and their standards.
Yes.
How are your feelings towards them and your relationships? Because we have been reading them and trying to interpret them and talking to them. But what's your feelings about them?
Well, what the shelter centre is looking for is a better tent. They've defined the tent as the solution. What they want is a better tent. So they originally started out looking to standardise the existing tent on something that everybody agreed would work. Because all of the NGOs and all the tent vendors produce slightly different tents. They're a bit bigger, they're a bit smaller, they're a bit higher, they're a bit lower. They're made of different kinds of canvas. And particularly they ship in different sized boxes. So the first impulse of the shelter centre was, let's all agree on one common tent, and we'll write a specification for that tent, and then anybody can manufacture them and they'll be interchangeable units. And
Because what you have made isn't somewhat contradictory to the standards that...
It's a completely radically different approach. So what happened was that when people started to think together about trying to make an improved tent, somebody said, well, what about things that aren't tents? What about hard-sided shelters? Or what about things like inflatable domes that you spray with concrete that would be good for long stay, transitional housing? And then it got into this much wider conversation about the nature of the shelter problem. So the shelter centre programme is torn between their initial desire to standardise the common disaster relief tent and all of this pressure to innovate in shelter from all these different angles. And the problem that they face is that innovation and standardisation are two opposite forces. and you've got a single body which is responsible for both standardization and innovation. So that's your first problem. The second problem is that they're designing a shelter prototype and also managing a standards process. So that's a little bit like having Microsoft develop a word processor and then call it an international standard. They're going to define the standard to fit what they believe to be technically possible. And if I took the Hexier and defined it as an international standard for refugee shelter, there's no tent technology that could meet that specification, because you can't get that kind of thermal performance out of a building that doesn't have hard sides. You see what I'm saying? So there's a whole bunch of political contradictions inside of the shelter standardization process, and then on top of that, it's very, very, very hard to develop a set of standards that take a process which is already limited and then improve it. Right? We're already very close to the limit of capability of the tent as a format. That's why there's all this pressure behind transitional housing. So what I would like to have seen is 2 programs, one of which was the attempt to fully standardize the existing tent equipment that they're using and say this is the tent, and then another program that said how do we dissolve the line between tents and transitional housing? What are our options for a sort of next generation sheltering system? And I think that if they separated those 2 programs out, it would be much easier to solve both problems successfully. But trying to run them inside of a single process is really, really difficult.
Because if you follow them, you could never send down anything that's made out of plywood, for example, because that would be too heavy and too big and
right?
not possible to fly and
That's
like
right,
that.
that's right. But I mean, if you assume that you've got to fly your solution into the area, you've already taken out anything that uses local materials.
Absolutely, but they have
But they
we have a lot of things there, and
Yeah,
we try to interpret them, and
I mean, if you
they are contradictory.
if you go through that list and you cross off everything which is an assumption that is tent centric, if you try and take it to a functional specification, where you say the shelter should have this much height and it should have this much weight and it should have these properties, and you cross out everything that's specific to tents, you very quickly see that the standard is kind of complicated and a little incomplete. Personally, I think it's more important to look at the standard as a way of solving the problem, because right now there is no shelter which actually hits the standard. There's nothing that you can buy that actually meets the standard that they set down, that I'm aware of. I don't think even the shelter module meets the standards. So at that point, it's only a question of can you get kind of close to the standards, or can you explain clearly why not? Because if you can say, this section of the standard is inapplicable because this shelter is designed to be transported by truck and manufactured locally, then you can at least say that you understood the standard and chose to ignore that section. Does that make sense?
So it's more like you see it as a way of looking at it and not necessarily the way of
Oh, it's not
looking
the
at
way.
it.
Even inside of the NGO world, nobody
Yeah.
thinks of it as the way.
Yeah, well,
Because-
because to us it's new, so
Yeah,
to us it was okay, here you have the standards, and it was
okay,
now we have to
okay.
do something that fits into this
Yeah, no,
EU
no,
code
don't.
and things like that.
It's
so-
not that kind of standard, right?
Okay.
The place to get that kind of information is really the sphere standards.
Mhm.
The sphere standards are really fairly good from my perspective. I think they're a pretty well written standard.
So
and
they're
it's,
more overall.
3.5 square meters per person for long stay storage. Or for storage, sorry. For long stay occupancy. That's a functional standard.
Yeah.
You can kind of work from that. Sphere still kind of assumes you're going to line everything up in rows and you're going to have this much space. But there's at least a bunch of stuff there that's about real human factors. The shelter center stuff is pretty technical, but technically it's kind of incomplete. It's really fundamentally everybody knows that shelter center is a big, complicated committee process, and what's going to come out of it is a committee document. And committee documents typically take all of the innovation out at the beginning and wind up with something that's kind of very, very simple, basic, standard. This is kind of what we want. Everything that people disagreed about has been taken out. So don't think of that stuff as any kind of chain. It's a starting point from one research project that had political contradictions embedded in it at the beginning. You can get a lot of useful information about what people want, but there's nothing that meets the standard completely. You can get a lot of information about what works if you're going to fly it into the area, but maybe you don't want to fly it in.
Okay.
Right? The other thing is that it kind of assumes that you're going to be building one shelter per family. Well, what if you want to build an enormous shelter that's something like an inflatable stadium and house a whole bunch of people in that for the short term? If you're going to have a disaster situation where after a month people can go home again, maybe a big inflatable stadium is exactly what you need. And Netherlands Red Cross is very enthusiastic about that kind of stuff. They've got some researchers who are thinking through those kind of issues. None of that stuff's anywhere close to those standards.
No.
So yeah, I would think of it as a starting point for one specific kind of shelters, but it's by no means the full answer, and it's not for transitional shelter.
Oh, thank you very much. It was interesting to get your point of view. We've been kind of
Yeah. No, and I mean, always feel free to contact me. You know, you can send me questions because I've got, you know, I've spent a few years banging my head against these walls, so I may be able to save you guys a little work on it. All right, where are we? Oh yeah, scalability. Do you have any more questions?
No, I'm fine right now. Thank
Okay,
you.
if you think of anything else, interrupt me. So spike production we covered, IP, no patents. NGOs don't like patent technologies. They want things that they can use, they want things that are free and open source and all the rest of that stuff. If possible, try and stay away from patents. Ecological factors, secondary but real. Nobody really cares that much about whether you make your shelter out of plastic, but it'd be nice if you made it out of, you know, organic, recycled, whatever. You know, bamboo, for example, is a wonderful material. It'd all be nice if we could use more bamboo. Would you mind opening those curtains? Because I have a feeling the video cameras might be not doing too well. It's kind of dark in here. If you open them a little, I think it'll make it bright enough to see, but not so bright. Yeah, that's probably good. You can still read the screen. Okay, so. So all of the rest of the stuff, right? Infrastructure like toilets and sanitation, that's an integral part of the shelter solution. If you just put up the tents and you don't deal with that kind of stuff, you get waterborne disease. What are the opportunities for designing systems that meet all of those essential survival needs as a package? Not a lot of work's been done on that. The Hexier project was really the first thing to look at bundling that kind of stuff alongside. It's just the beginning. There's a whole set of things to do there. Agricultural self-sufficiency. Again, this doesn't apply in all areas. There are some places where people aren't going to regrow food because they're going to go back home in 3 months. There are other areas where they're simply not able to or allowed to restart farming. But in some situations, it'd be really interesting to have a fast start agriculture program where you put the shelters up and you ship them tools and seeds and know-how, and somehow you get agriculture restarted. I don't think there are any super easy answers to that, but boy howdy, it'd be an interesting question. You know? If we could actually figure out how to do fast start agriculture, there are a ton of situations where that would be very valuable. And I'm actually part of a distributed research project that's working on this. If you Google the phrase emergency permaculture, you'll find a bunch of our work. Disaster relief, local trades and skills. Again, you get a situation where the economy just gets wiped out because the tourists aren't coming anymore and all the hotels are destroyed. What do you need to provide to get people's local skills back in operation? Do you need to provide basic hand tools? Do you need to provide raw materials? You know, does it turn out that you need to ship in a bunch of sheet metal and some tools and people can then go back to producing what they made before? These are all kind of open questions, but it's worth thinking about, like, are there specific kinds of disasters where you can respond in a way that helps people get back on their feet economically? You know, one example of that might be things like bicycles. You know, it's a standard mode of transport all over the world. After disaster, if all their bicycles are gone, they can't return to their job, deliver the messages and all the rest of this kind of stuff. What happens if you start looking at putting the tools that people need to earn a livelihood back into the situation alongside shelter? Nobody knows. Refugee camps, you know, what would happen if you went out and you gave everybody in a refugee camp you know, basic tools for doing things like hair care, you know, like hair cutting tools? What if you gave them the things they needed to make clothes, you know, needles, thread, fabric? You know, what are the opportunities for helping people restart an internal economy inside of a camp? Do you have refugee camp dollars, which are going to be good for trade inside of the camp? Lots of opportunities there. Not very much work has been done on this. One of the guys who was one of the designers of the euro, an economist called Bernard Leither, actually did a round of work on designing a currency for trade inside of refugee camps. Wow, you know, to return people to their productive occupations. Good work. Okay, technical solutions for social problems. Let me just define controversial. In Iraq, right, you've got this terrible problem that the US went in, blew up all of the infrastructure in the city, bombed the power grids, bombed the water stations, the whole thing. Then they're in a position where they can't rebuild that stuff because every time they try and rebuild it, somebody attacks the people trying to rebuild it or blows it up as a statement of Yankee go home. Now, it's a disaster, and it's a disaster that all sides are contributing to maintaining. One of the things about that is that there have been 3 or 4 attempts inside of the Department of Defense to try and look at what happens if you use solar power and wind power as a way of getting the lights back on. If you go to each house in Iraq and you put a solar panel on the roof that they can use for interior light and recharging their phones and maybe watching television, then you're taking some of the social complexity out of the problem. Because rather than having one agency owning the power grid, one agency guarding it, and one agency using it, so you get 3 sets of people who've got different goals, you've got one person who owns the power, guards the power, and uses the power, because it's their solar panel on their roof and they're in charge of it. And if that approach had been taken, it's very likely that most of Iraq would have much better electrical access than it does right now. And that's an example of a technical solution to a social problem. And over and over and over again, I think that it's possible to look at some of what's going on and say there are technical solutions for some social problems. Certainly not all of them, but some of them. And where possible, we should try and look for those opportunities, because goodness knows it's a lot easier than solving social problems at a social level. Okay, so we change gear a little here. 2 critical insights. This is the core pitch that I want to make. Taking things that are already in the global supply chain and turning it into the things that you need to survive is probably the right way to do this. If it's already being used in 100 million ton quantities around the world, it's probably safe to design with that as an input to your process, because it's always going to be around, the price is going to be stable, and there's a good chance they have it on the continent where your problem is. So saves on the stockpiling costs, gives you scalability. It's how we design the hex here. Things that might work that way. So does water purification, where you put the water into the plastic bottles and leave it in the sun. I mean, we use gigatons of the necessary materials. It's plastic soda bottles. Some kinds of toilets, there's probably a lot of opportunity to design a toilet that's based on a 5-gallon plastic bucket that really effectively works. If not, there are lots of appropriate technology toilets that are really pretty decent. What would it take to package them in a way that you could do mass manufacture quickly? And I can give you some pointers on that if you're interested. What else can be done this way? There's a ton of essential services that we could be providing for people using stuff that's already common in the supply chain. What's the limit of that process? I don't know. But I really want to stress, you want to find stuff that's already being used on a huge scale globally and figure out how to quickly and effectively turn that into survival services. And remember that 6 ways to die model that we talked about back at the beginning? So that's a good map of what services people need to survive. And I think I'm going to go back and talk about that one before we finish. Second insight. Disaster relief and development aid. At the end of the day, it's the same field. It's getting people back into a position where they're not rapidly dying of stuff. And you know, thinking of it as a continuum of how do we take these people from where they are to a position where they can basically take care of themselves is, I think, a much better designed question, because in a developed world disaster, if you could put everything back the way it was before the disaster, things are now fine. In a developing world disaster, if you put everything back the way it was before the disaster, things are not fine. So you want to do better than restoring it to where it was. You want to figure out how to put it back into a position where you've got acceptable mortality rates. Political problems around this. Oh my God, the division between the disaster relief NGOs and the development NGOs is really huge. They don't work together very well. Governments are even worse. There's very little political union here. But that doesn't mean that that's not an accurate definition. This whole thing about poverty and resilience, you know, don't forget that. The reason that these people are so fragile is because they were already poor. They don't have backup. Disaster relief. Why is it an easy problem? There's a bunch of money, right? You can spend $20 to $50 to $100 per person involved in a disaster pretty easily because the West will fund. Small populations, you get a few million people affected, worst case, as opposed to poverty that's billions of people. World public opinion gets involved, you get the press, there's logistical and political support. Poverty is just massively, massively harder. But if you could get big progress in disaster relief, there's a pretty good chance that a lot of that stuff will also apply to poverty. There's a lot of opportunity there. Things that are pushing this situation forward. South-South cooperation, right? You know, the Chinese are doing infrastructure development in Africa. Well, they've got a very different approach from the colonial powers that went over there because they've been poor recently. They remember what it was like. Is it better? Is it worse? Is it good? Is it bad? Those are open questions. But it's done in a different style, and I think that's probably true for disaster relief too. ICT, we've talked about this, cell phones, GPS, SATCOM, sat maps. There's lots of new tools on the table that can be used to solve these problems. Interagency cooperation. Because we've got much more collaboration possible because of the internet, because of email, cheap international cell phones, lots of international meetings, agencies are getting better at working together. And that's a really, really important thing. The better these agencies get at cooperating, the more opportunity there is for fundamental change. And you know, things like the European Union spend a lot of money trying to get better international cooperation. Those are really things that we can support, things that we can work with. Finally, because there's so much more media and so much more ease of communication, we're beginning to expect better performance in disaster relief from the NGOs and the governments. The bottom line is that the American government's reputation will never really recover from Hurricane Katrina because it was such a disaster and it was almost entirely caused by bureaucracy. People expect better than that, and they're going to put pressure on that situation. As you see people beginning to blog and send video out of refugee camps and out of disaster areas, you'll see much more pressure on the NGOs to perform better. And all of these factors contribute to pushing the state of the art beyond where it is now and into new territory. And as I said, this is not all, this is not a problem that somebody else sat down and solved. This stuff is all wide open for people to get involved in and make a contribution to. So, timescales, right? I invented the hex here in 2002. First field test was first test was 2003. And I spent about 10 days in one in the middle of a desert in 110 degree Fahrenheit, which is, what is that, 40 Celsius? Something like that? 35 Celsius? 40, yeah. With 60-mile-an-hour winds, dust storms. And I was there for about a week, and it was great. Fantastic. So 2005, United States Department of Defense picked up the design and said, wow, this is really cool. I did a bunch of planning for using hexyurts to clean up after a nuclear bomb in America. If there was a nuclear blast, you'd have to rehouse something like 10 to 20 million people immediately afterwards. And you couldn't rehouse them in the general population because many of them would be radiologically contaminated. So, emergency housing in that situation is a big deal. Okay, great. So now there's a Department of Defense testing program. 2007, 2008, I got talking to the Netherlands Red Cross. They said, this is very cool, we like this. Can we get some for testing? They got a testing program going. We're trying to arrange how to get them into that testing program. So, that's 7 years from the point where the thing was invented and we still don't have a field test. It's a slow process because the bureaucracy on the other end of these situations has no money for development. They're just not allocating funds to this kind of stuff. Even the US Department of Defense was using these tiny little, $10,000 or $20,000 slices of money that were left over from year-end budgets. It's not like there's a big pool of money waiting to pool these new ideas into the field. So opportunities like cooperation with, SRA, or any other NGO group that will talk to you, grab that stuff and work with them as much as possible, because otherwise it's a really, really slow process. If we did field tests for the Hexier and it worked great, it might take 10 years before you saw 2 or 3 million people in them. It's a really, really slow field, but it is getting faster and the internet in general is accelerating change in all areas. That's the good news, right? And finally, we can all actually help with this process. It's not an area that's dominated by an enormous number of skilled engineers who solved all these problems 20 years ago. It's not like trying to design a new aircraft, where there are huge companies that have got really top people working on this stuff all the time. My estimate is that there are less than 100 people globally who are full-time researchers into shelter issues. I think it's less than 100 people globally. Which is really kind of shocking when you think about it. You know, there are a lot of people who are involved in deploying shelter, but there are very few pure researchers. And most of those people start a company and then try and sell the shelter and then go bust because the NGOs take 5 years to buy one. So what comes out of that is the real opportunity here is for open source research, where one group picks up an idea, does some development work, publishes everything, doesn't have any patents, and then moves on to do something else. Another group can pick that work up and continue it for another cycle. And slowly, many, many different groups who each carry the task for 6 months or a year or 2 years can move it up this long, long, long chain of cause and effect until finally you get a new solution that's in the field. But it's going to take a different approach to the approach of start a company and immediately commercialize, because people have been trying that approach for years and it just doesn't work. You know, there are 2 or 3 little shelter companies. There's World Shelters, Global Village Shelters. There's a couple other little outfits that have really, really interesting shelter technologies, but they're just not making enough money to get by on, really. I think World, I'm trying to remember, there's a dome company whose name is temporarily escaping me that actually survives and makes a living this way. But in general, it's not something where the existing development models work very well. But there's lots of room for open source style collaboration to make this stuff happen. And I think, is that the last slide? Yes, that's it. So I'm going to go back just close to the beginning to point out one more thing in a little more detail. So this model of, you know, too hot, too cold, hunger, thirst, illness, and injury. Individual, household, town, region, world. This model is really useful when you start trying to define systems, right? A shelter is primarily to protect you from the heat and the cold, and it's mainly household level. If you designed a shelter that was a municipal level shelter would be something like a big inflatable stadium you could put everybody into, because that can be like a town-sized solution. It would be beyond the individual family level. You know, cooking, you could have an individual level stove, you could have a regional stove, a town level stove, where you've got a big solar oven and you put your food into the solar oven along with everybody else's and you take it out and it's cooked. Some really interesting approaches like that. Same thing with water purification. Normally it's done at a municipal level. Sometimes you do it with a water filter like a biosand filter at a household level. There's an outfit called Life Straw that I think is associated with a Swedish company. And they put water purification at an individual level because they give you this thing that you carry around your neck that you use to drink through like a straw. Life Straw. So there's lots of room for thinking about these solutions in terms of sheltered infrastructure in a systematic way. What kind of threat to your bodily welfare is it protecting you from, and what's the level that it's operating at? Is it individual, is it household, is it beyond the house? Is it a regional solution? So this is a really useful model, and it's open source. It's called 6 Ways to Die, and if you punch that into Google, it will come up with the PDFs. And if you need an editable file, I have one I can put up. But it's a good way of framing the problem and beginning to talk about, for a specific shelter, what range of environments is it going to protect you against? If it's going to protect you against heat, is it going to protect you against cold? If so, how hot, how cold? You know, does it have any secondary benefits? If you make a hexier out of a very reflective material, one of the things you can do is put 2 hexiers together at the right angle, and it will make a gigantic solar cooker between the 2 reflective walls. Could be all kinds of applications for sterilizing food, for sterilizing water, for cooking. There's lots of ways that you can think about these problems. So I think I'm done. It's on my notes.